Hi everybody, and welcome back to Scary Nightmare. Before we begin, make sure to drop a comment below by letting me know where you're watching from and what time is it for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, smash me that subscribe button right now. And for now, let's continue our Scary Nightmare adventure. 1, 2, 3, action. One last thing. If it ever goes dark in the middle of the day, just stay in your house tonight. That's what the driver said before falling silent. I chuckled at the bizarre suggestion, as if it hadn't been enough to instate a ridiculous nightmare curfew and forbid any romantic attachments with the inhabitants of the town. They also wanted me to hide from the dark? Detective, this ain't no joke. If you can't follow these instructions, we're turning around and I'm taking you back to the city. He slowed down the car and looked back at me. He hadn't been the friendliest person at all. I mean, hell, he hadn't even given me his name, but the pure intensity of his stare made it clear how serious he actually was. All right, as you wish. Why would it go dark in the middle of the day anyway? Last time I checked, there wasn't a solar eclipse scheduled for this year. Before the driver could answer my half-serious jab at his rules, a van came speeding towards us. He pulled us to the side of the narrow road, allowing the van wish its flashing blue lights to pass unobstructed. In the split second where it drove by, I noticed 2 police officers occupying the vehicle. They seemed to be in a hurry, I said, expecting the driver to explain. Seriously, why are they driving out of town in such a rush? I continued. Well, they're looking for Patrick, the dumbass who tried to leave town a few days ago. I guess a local hunter must have found him or something. His second comment piqued my curiosity. The ominous insinuation, said in such a casual manner, meant I had to keep digging. What is going on? Are you trying to tell me that he is not allowed to leave? Of course he is. Don't be stupid. It is just that he trailed off. Just that? What? That's what I asked. Then the driver was like, listen, I'm just a damn driver. If you have any questions, the sheriff will be happy to fill you in. He seemed on edge just having me in his car. I'd offered to drive into town myself, but the powers that be had insisted I get picked up, as the road was treacherous and confusing. Based on what I'd seen that far, they hadn't lied. The road was broken and in dire need of maintenance, and there were almost no signs to guide our way on our journey. Before long, we passed by the first road sign I'd seen in hours, just a simple piece of wood with the town's name written on it. Tenebrous, not a particularly welcoming sight, but it served its purpose. After another mile or so, we pulled onto an almost empty street, no more than 5 minuscule buildings that were supposed to be houses. The driver parked outside one of them and got outside. After you drop off your stuff, I'm taking you down to the sheriff's department, and that's what he said. Before he entered my humble abode, the driver walked over to a power box and flipped a switch. Dim lights flickered to life, barely illuminating the dark interior. The place was run down and barely comparable to a 2-star motel. Not that it mattered while I was on the job. Luxuries had never been a part of my work. And as we entered, bugs and insects scurried away from the wet doormat covering the floor. The place only seemed to have 3 rooms. The main one was a living room with a sofa bed and a stove. A hybrid room for all purposes. Other than that area, there were 2 doors, one leading to the bathroom and one with a sign reading curfew pantry. I tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. How come it's locked? I asked. Without speaking a word, the driver walked over and gave it a solid pull. After the 3rd or so attempt, it flew open, revealing hundreds of cans, non-perishable goods. It was enough to feed a family for about a year. Then I said, I'm only staying a month. You know that, right? I asked that nervously. Then he sighed and nodded. It is just for emergencies. If it suddenly goes dark, there is no telling how long we will be stuck for. So in case the sun vanishes, I just stay here? For how long? I asked half sarcastically, still skeptical to the whole situation. Then he thought for a moment before responding, saying usually just a couple of hours. He trailed off. I said, usually? He said, God knows. It could be longer. I said, how long? And I asked that firmly. He fell silent again, not willing to answer the stream of questions I kept producing. Just drop your damn bags and let's go visit the sheriff, he ordered. Without further argument, I put my bags down on the table, carefully keep them away from the bug-infested floors. I chuckled briefly to myself, thinking that in the very least I wouldn't be lonely. And as we drove through the town, I got a better look at the tired-looking buildings. They seemed so ancient, as if they had been built back in the 50s and subsequently forgotten about. There were a few people out on the streets, all looking cold and exhausted beyond measure. None of them particularly excited to have a stranger visit them, it seemed. The sheriff's department didn't fare much better than the rest of town. It was a mix between an office building and a jail, too small to keep many criminals in place. But I suppose that in a town that small, crime wasn't much of an issue, at least officially. The deaths had all been ruled accidental. An older man came to greet us as we arrived, accompanied by 2 younger officers. He wore a thin smile on his face, a tired one at that, but the first sign of friendliness I'd met. I reached out my hand, and he gripped it firmly. Then he said, "You must be Robert," as he was shaking my hand. Then he said, "I'm Bill Riley, the sheriff around these parts." And when it came to the other 2 officers, they didn't smile. They just stared at me with suspicion in their eyes. Then one of them asked, "Why is he here anyways?" The sheriff turned back towards him, with his smile vanishing, replaced by a stern look. The man fell silent, and the sheriff redirected his attention towards me. "Don't mind them. It is good to have you here. We're in dire need of a forensic pathologist," especially after he said before I interrupted him. Then I said, "Hold on for a moment. I'm not a pathologist, not anymore at least." Then he responded by saying, "But your file said so." "That was a long time ago," I said quickly. The sheriff took the hint and didn't push the issue any further. Before we get inside, a van pulled up behind the building. It was the same one I'd seen speeding past us as we entered the town. The sheriff rushed over to assess the situation, and they pulled a covered stretcher out from the back. "You found him?" the sheriff asked surprisingly. The officers nodded and carried the stretcher inside. We followed them in through a set of metal doors, which led to an old-fashioned autopsy lab. The distinct smell of formaldehyde burned through my nose as we got inside. The sheriff pulled the covers off the stretcher, which revealed the pale corpse of a middle-aged man. While the cause of death wasn't immediately apparent, I suspected some sort of cardiovascular condition, with his eyes deep red from conjunctival bleeding and his legs swollen. Then the sheriff asked, "Where'd you find this guy?" "Just at the edge of town. He didn't even make it across the border. Poor bastard." That's just what I said. Then they all stared helplessly at the dead man on the table before directing their attention at me. "Robert, would you mind assisting us with the autopsy?" I took a step back, and the sheriff noticed my trepidation. With a look of mild concern, he put his hand on my shoulder, and then he said, "Look, I wouldn't ask if I had another choice. I'll stay behind and help, but I just can't do it on my own." After an eternity of uncomfortable silence, I put the discomfort aside and agreed to help. I realized that while most of the officers in the room had dealt with dead bodies, none had ever dealt with dissecting a cadaver. Just the act of cutting a human being into their most basic parts was something entirely different that I'd never gotten used to. Together, we jotted down all the basic information regarding the man who I had come to know as Patrick Lawrence. After taking down his weight, height, age, and observed all the minor wounds, bruises, and other recognizable marks on his body, time had come to get the scalpel. Then he said, "You don't have to be here for this." I looked at the profusely sweating sheriff, and then he said, "I'm fine. Do you have an autopsy lab?" But no pathologist in sight. That's what I asked, more to get his mind off the side in front of him than out of curiosity. Then he said, "Yeah, we do." Then I said, "Where is he?" Then he said, "You're looking at him," he said as he gestured to the corpse in front of me. I felt ashamed. Being from a larger city meant that all my cases had dealt with strangers, but in a town as small as Denbras, everyone was either a colleague, friend, or family. Then I said I'm sorry as I was mumbling. Without further ado, I sank my scalpel into the man's abdomen. The blade cut through the skin and fat without a problem. I created the typical Y-shaped incision necessary for easy access. Then I put my hand down the newly formed hole, ready to expand open his cavities. Inside, I expected resistance. I fumbled around for a bit with the wet and slightly warm sensation of decaying organs brushing against my head. Panic started to rise in my body as I realized that instead of half-rotten organs, I felt nothing. Then I said, no, that cannot be right, and I was mumbling that to myself. Then the sheriff said, "What?" Then I said I kept expanded until his entire abdomen and chest cavity were visible. There within Patrick Lawrence, instead of a heart, lungs, kidneys, and liver, there was nothing, just a few chunks of what resembled minced meat, as if something had shredded him to pieces from inside. The two of us stared at the empty corpse on the table. The sheriff, as disgusted as he must have been, he didn't seem all that surprised. Then I began asking him quietly, and I said, "Do you know anything about this?" But I said this with a demanding tone. Then he said, "No what?" Then I said, "What state the corpse would be in?" And I said that in an agitated way. Then he sighed and said, No, I didn't." According to the vague reports about the town that had been given, at least a dozen people showed up dead every year, while the number on its own was ludicrous for such a small town. It would be impossible not to have noticed their complete lack of internal organs. Do you really expect me to believe that, after all the people who died here in the past few decades, that none showed up like this? Come on. Then the sheriff said that's the thing, they never showed up, as we were leaving the autopsy lab. Then we walked into this office where he pulled out a bunch of photos, all showing what appeared to be extremely decayed and partially skeletal remains. We always found them months after the fact, and by then, it wouldn't be much of a surprise if wildlife had stripped their insides. But this is definitely something else. He put the photos away and locked his office. So then I asked him, "You never found any fresh hollowed out corpses?" Then he said, "No, not really." Well, actually, Patrick, his last autopsy seemed to have disturbed him. Then I asked the sheriff and I said, "What happened?" He said, 3 days ago, our local pharmacist went missing at night, and when we found him the next day, he'd be long since died. And Patrick did the autopsy. Then I said, "And?" Then he kept raving about the emptiness inside, making no sense. It was like he'd completely lost it, which isn't all that weird, considering the job. But we didn't know exactly what he saw. He burned the body before we could stop him and fled town. Then we exited the building to report to the other officers, all of them smoking, relaxing as if nothing had happened. He briefed the others while I lit up a cigarette of my own. A nasty habit I hadn't quit years ago, but considering the circumstances, it literally felt appropriate. The sheriff kept glancing at his watch and then at the rapidly setting sun. Time had gone away from us within the windowless autopsy hall, and curfew was about to start. Then the sheriff said, "You better be home. Come on, Robert, I'll catch up with you in the morning." I immediately tossed a half cigarette down on the ground, and I said, "Wait, first, you're gonna tell me what the hell is going on here." The sheriff said, "Tomorrow, I promise," as he was reaching out his hand, saying, "I appreciate your help today. I really do." I then hesitantly agreed to leave. The driver took me back to my house without speaking a word, and I headed inside to get ready for a restless night. It was an uncomfortable place to live, with boring food and a bathroom that had no functioning light, meaning I had to use the provided flashlight just to take a piss. Can you imagine that? Then as I was chilling in my house, I searched the pantry for something to eat, and to my surprise, I found an unopened bottle of whiskey just resting there. I drank it while going over the case files I'd been given prior to my departure towards Tenebris. 5 detectives had been sent there before me, all who returned unsettled, but none the wiser regarding the strange deaths. By the time I finished half the bottle, I drifted off to an uneasy slumber, a sleep filled with complicated nightmares from my past. Events and impossible situations I struggled to escape, but that had ultimately landed me here in Tenebris. I then woke up in the early morning of the next day with a splitting headache and an overabundance of regret. I glanced at the time to see it had only gone past 7 a.m., meaning I still had ample time to recover. The first daylight peeked through my window, and I grumpily covered them with the curtains, hoping to get another hour of sleep before I got up. I could have sworn only a second passed before I woke again to a bizarrely warm air around me. I got up, intending to open a window, when I noticed it was completely dark outside. I was absolutely surprised and in panic. I was worried that I'd slept through the whole entire day, all hungover and annoyed. I grabbed my phone to call the sheriff. Then when I noticed the time, it was literally still 7:42 a.m., which means only 40 minutes had passed. I stuck my head out through the window and tried to get a look around back again. Even the streetlights seemed obscured by the darkness, their yellow glow barely visible. I dialed the number to the sheriff's department, but he didn't pick up. Then I attempted to call him on his personal number. He picked up almost immediately, but his voice was obscured behind a static-like mist of sound. "Rob, it stands, keeps, don't." That's literally how he sounded like. I literally managed to get out before the connection broke. I slumped back down in bed, the driver's warning playing on loop in the back of my mind. If it ever goes dark in the middle of the day, just stay in your house and hide. Then I saw someone move out on the street, just a shadow hidden in the dark, with the warning of dangers lurking in the dark. I was torn between hiding or calling out to check if the person needed help. He wasn't far away, so I could run outside and get him safe easily enough. I literally began talking to this guy and I said, "Hello, are you alright?" My voice muffled as if the air itself had grown too thick. The shadow heard my call and turned towards me. It literally moved with unnaturally exaggerated movements, seeming to skip steps. At first I thought it was one of my neighbors, but even as it walked under the partially dimmed streetlight, it still didn't come into proper view. It dawned on me that the thing wasn't human. I wanted to duck away from the window and hide, but I was frozen in fear. My eyes kept focused on the slowly approaching figure. Then I noticed another shadow approaching from down the street, and another, dozens of shadows wandering the streets of Tenebris, all of them heading towards me. Self-preservation might not be most redeeming quality, so when I saw a figure walking around in the overwhelming darkness, my first instinct was to help them. That fact, mixed with the skull-crushing headache I'd received as a parting gift from the alcohol, caused me to fuck up monumentally enough to call out into the dark. There on the streets, hundreds of dark figures approached me, mere shadows with humanoid features barely resembling people. While they hadn't necessarily seen me, they definitely heard me idiotically call out through the window. I ducked down of sight and closed the blinds. I contemplated whether I should leave the light off to keep myself hidden or turn it on to fight the darkness. Then I noticed a few scribbles in a piece of paper posted under the light switch. Leaving that on, I turned on every switch I could find, hoping it could repel the bizarre creatures from entering my temporary home. Then after I locked all doors and windows, I collected my mobile phone, my gun, and the provided flashlight before boarding myself up inside the pantry. And with little hesitation, I decided to call the sheriff again, hoping he could give me some further instructions on how to survive the oncoming nightmare. Alas, despite my best efforts, the call wouldn't go through. I glanced down at my service weapon and considered whether hiding or escape would be my best option. But even if bullets could maim the creatures, I wouldn't have nearly enough ammunition to put a dent in the horde. Literally, guys, my only option was to just be hidden inside until the darkness rescinded. I mean, the driver had told me earlier that only a couple of hours would pass while the darkness loomed over us. And while I prayed that was true, something within me felt instinctively doubtful. I kept as quiet as I could, keeping my eyes fixed on the door in front of me and a hand on a gun while I couldn't hear the creatures move around. I know they'd gotten close once the lights outside the pantry started to dim. It wasn't as if the lights died, but more like their presence literally just swallowed the light. The sliver of light that sneaked in under the door had all but vanished. I had little more than the weak light bulb inside the pantry, and my exceptionally strong flashlight left to keep my company. Hours passed, and I held my breath as I awaited what felt like my inevitable demise. Then days passed as well, and the darkness remained. I tried my best to preserve the battery on my phone, only turning it on a few hours to check the time and attempting to call for backup. I managed to keep the phone going for a week before it eventually died. I mean, even if I had the charger with me, there were no outlets to connect it to. The pantry itself had become a disgusting prison. Food and water wasn't exactly a scarce resource, but dealing with my bathroom habits made me weigh the pros and cons of consuming anything more than absolute necessities. Time became a foreign concept without my phone to keep track of it. I had to rely on my own internal clock, which had been wrecked by the lack of a day and night cycle. Based on the growth of my beard, I assumed 2 weeks had passed by the time I looked at my gun as more of a way out than means of self-defense. By then, the light outside my door had completely vanished. It had taken the creatures a long time to consume all the light, but once they were done, I could see silvers of shadow penetrate from under the door. I shined my light at it, which seemed to keep them at bay, but it only had so much battery power, including the extra batteries left in the pantry. Day by day, my sanity started to fade. Every thought was occupied by the immense desire to escape, be it through a heroic act of defiance or by a bullet to my own head. Then, as if a switch had been flicked, a beam of bright light appeared under the door. A heavily white light, brighter and more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. I stared at it in disbelief. Could this be daylight? I don't know. And I didn't even dare to open the door. I must have sat there for an hour before a familiar voice finally broke my trance. Then all of a sudden I heard a sheriff calling out, "Robert, are you in there?" I carefully started dismantling the makeshift barricade I'd placed in front of the door and stumbled out into the bright hall of my home. The light of day hit me with blinding power. "Thank God, you're still here. We literally thought that we lost you." And that's what Sheriff Riley exclaimed as I opened the door. I kept staring at him for a moment before I fully believed he was real. Then I started stuttering, saying, What happened?" Robert tried to hold back a grimace as he noticed the smell and sight of his own worn-out body. Then the sheriff stepped inside and closed the door to keep me out of sight. I caught a brief glance at my own reflection in the window, greasy hair, untrimmed beard, and bloodshot eyes. Then I asked how long was I in there. The sheriff responded saying 19 days. It is literally the longest time we've ever, and then he trailed off as he noticed the look of dread on my face. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Robert. I'm very sorry." I then reeked of sweat and shift after being trapped in my own filth for almost 3 weeks. The sheriff seemed slightly fresher than myself, probably having had access to a bathroom. I know it wasn't his fault that I was trapped up in the pantry. If I hadn't called out for the creatures, I could have stayed safely inside my own home and lived an isolated but comfortable life. But here we are. I had a lot of questions, but in my tired state, all I could think of was to clean myself up first. "I'm gonna have a shower," that's what I said. Then he nodded understandingly and said he'd wait for me while I get ready. As I washed the past weeks of my body, I finally started to formulate a plan. I'd been so preoccupied with surviving that I hadn't been able to question the reality of the situation. I decided that the best course of action would be to call headquarters back in the city. I was out of my depth and needed serious reinforcements. Then when I got out from the bathroom, I saw Riley talking on the radio with a distraught expression on his face. So I asked him what's wrong. Then he responded with, "I just got word from the others. We've lost some people. The others are out looking, but the situation seems pretty bleak." That's what he said. I said, "How many?" He said, "I don't know. Current count is literally 24. I said, "Jesus Christ, that's a lot." The longest bout of darkness only lasted a couple of days, and that was almost 30 years ago. This is... The words got stuck in his throat, and he couldn't even complete the sentence. Though he had fared far better than myself in hiding, the people that had been taken were his own, friends and family members that he'd known for his whole entire life. And it had taken a toll on him. A surge of pity filled my body as I realized the true gravity of the situation. Then I said, "Sheriff Riley, we're going to figure this out. Don't worry, I promise you. We just need to get help from the city to let people know what is going on here." He nodded with acceptance, saying, "You're right, but what are we going to tell them?" I said, "The truth. That's what we're gonna tell them." I then immediately charged my phone and attempted to call my supervisor. He was a good, albeit skeptical person, but even he couldn't reject a call for help with several dozen people missing. The phone wouldn't even ring. Not a single bar of signal visible on the little screen. By all accounts, we'd effectively been cut off from civilian. I ran through a few ideas, ready to suggest that we just drive a town over. But before I could formulate a proper plan, someone called Riley over the radio. And then there was that voice of that person saying, "Sheriff, are you there? Can you hear me?" Then the sheriff picked it up and responded, saying, "James, yeah, I'm here. What's going on? We found something at the edge of town." "We literally don't know," the officer said with a shaky voice. "Oh God." Then the sheriff asked him, "What did you find?" Then he responded saying, "There was a wall of darkness. It just took loose." And then as he was saying, "We need to get out of," he cut off. And we didn't hear the rest of what he was trying to say. Then after that, Sheriff Riley kept calling his name, asking him if he can hear. "James, can you hear me?" Oh my God. He's not responding. Then he kept repeating himself. And as he was repeating himself, he got no response on the other end. Then I noticed the sheriff turning towards me with terror in his eyes. Then he said, "We have to help them." So we immediately rushed to the car and started speeding towards the border, only stopping briefly at the station to see if anyone had gotten back. But apart from a prison guard too old to partake in a search and rescue operation, it was seemingly abandoned. The streets were empty, everyone either hiding in their homes, while the police did their search. Yet, despite every available officer being on duty, we were somehow still able to reach any of them through the radio. Then as we were speeding down the road, I started asking, "What are these creatures, and where do they come from?" Riley glanced over at me with a look of confusion on his face, saying, "What creatures?" Then I immediately told him I saw shadows wandering through the dark, just barely resembling humans. There were hundreds of them. Before I could ask any further questions, a car came speeding towards us from the opposite direction. Riley swerved to the side, narrowly avoid collision, while the other car broke violently, skidding into the ditch. A panicked man stumbled out of the car, his face bruised from the crash. Then Sheriff Riley said, "What the fuck are you doing?" Then James responded saying, "They're all dead. I just left them there. I'm sorry. I couldn't. He stuttered as he frantically looked around. I stared towards the horizon from where James had fled. The light at the horizon seemed to cut off, fading harshly from day to night, as pitch-black clouds were moving towards us. For each second passed, the wall of darkness grew closer and closer. It was what had terrified James and what had killed the others. "Sheriff, we need to move," I said as he tried to comfort James. I turned around and noticed the same darkness had occupied the horizon behind us. By the time we picked James up, the darkness had enveloped the entire town, shrinking by each second passed. "I do not want to die. I don't want to die," James kept repeating as he sat panicked in the back seat, the shadow inching its way towards town, while we sped down the road in desperate attempt to reach safety before it was too late. James was in shock, and while I could have given him a few words of comfort, I sensed that he needed something to swiftly bring him back to reality. Without warning, I turned around and slapped him firmly on his cheek. He immediately snapped back to attention and said, "What was that for?" His voice was still shaky, but at least he was a little focused now. I said, "Need to break you away from your hysteria. I mean, it's a crude method, I know, but it worked, didn't it?" He nodded, still shook but thankful. I peeked out through the back window of our speeding car, watching as the darkness grew ever closer at an accelerated pace. "This hasn't happened before, right?" I half-asked, half-stated. Riley didn't even respond. His eyes were fixed on the road and his hands grasping the steering wheel in a mix of panic and determination. Just as town came into view, a massive wall of darkness shut into the road, cutting our lane off completely. "Watch out," James yelled. But it was futile. Riley swerved away from the darkness onto the other lane, causing the car to spin uncontrollably before putting us at an abrupt stop only a few feet away from the dark. No, just keep driving," James yelled as the shadows started enveloping the car. Small tendrils slithered their way through cracks in the window, wrapping around James. I said, "Oh God, help me," before I could even try to pull him away. The tendrils dug their way into his chest and abdomen. His blood-curdling screams of agony quickly faded as his throat filled with blood, and within seconds he could do little but writhe around hopelessly and whimper in pain. I fumbled around for the flashlights and I pointed it at the window. The shadow immediately retreated back out, retracting from the light. Then I yelled, "The headlights!" The headlights, everyone." Riley had already reached out to turn the high beams on. The bright light shoved the shadows away, just long enough for us to make a swift escape. "James, are you alright?" That's what I asked. He didn't respond. He just sat motionless in his seat, eyes wide open and lifeless. "James," Riley chimed in. He's dead," I said as I checked his pulse. I thought about performing CPR, but his abdomen just seemed sunken in, as if he'd simply been hollowed out by the shadow. And with no time to stop, we let James' corpse sit there while we made out our way into town, leaving nothing but a tiny opening of light as the void surrounded us. And in the center, we were met by a small group of survivors. They'd put up a perimeter of bonfires and powerful searchlights. Though it seemed to keep the shadows at bay, silvers of darkness still tried to absorb the light, dimming it second by second. Then we stopped the car and bolted out, leaving James' lifeless body behind. An older man, who I recognized as the nameless driver, met us with a strong flashlight and gestured for us to follow. "George, thank God. How many people made it?" Riley asked. Then he said, "We've got about a dozen setting up a barrier, while the rest are scavenging for supplies. But we ain't got long. We need to get inside the station," he said. It was a chaotic retreat back into the sheriff's department. There wasn't the safest place to be. It was the only building not yet consumed by the dark. As we ran inside the building, something emerged from the edge of the shadow wall, just looming on the border. "What's that?" Riley asked. It was one of the things I'd seen wander in the dark, the beings that kept me trapped within my pantry for weeks. "It's them. It's the creatures I saw," I yelled in panic, as George and Riley both instinctively put their flashlights towards it, and the shadow quickly retreated back to the dark. But before it did, the true horrific nature of the being revealed itself. They weren't shadows, but mangled messes of flesh and human organs held together by an unseen force. It was as if someone had created a poor reconstruction of a person, having nothing more than guts and muscles to work with. Riley immediately said, "What the hell are these things?" as he was yelling out loud. I responded saying, "I don't know, but let's keep them the fuck away." We mounted a few searchlights on the outside of the building and lit a few fires before barricading the doors to the station. "How long till the dark goes away?" I asked, knowing in my heart what the answer would be. I did not think it well. "Not this time," George said quietly. The darkness kept growing closer, slowly consuming the light and breaking through our barricade. "Is there any way out of town?" I asked. "Only the main road, but it does not matter. We cannot leave this place now." "Do you have any better suggestions?" I asked. "It's only a matter of time before they break through, and once they do, we're all gonna die." Riley kept quiet for a moment while he pondered his response. The others had collected any weapons and lights they could find to keep the shadows at bay, but it could do little more than to buy us a few hours. Though we had an overabundance of food and ammunition, electricity was a scarce resource. "How long can we keep this place running?" Riley asked. "Without anyone to run the power stations, we would have about 12 hours, George responded. "Sorry, Sheriff. I think this is it for us." I looked at him in disbelief that he'd give up so easily without a fight. "No, we can't just give up. Listen, I saw at least 3 patrol cars outside. We could mount lights to them and at least attempt to escape," I argued. They looked at me without saying a word. There was something they weren't telling me, a reason why they were so willing to just surrender. "We can't leave," Riley finally said. I said, "Why the fuck not?" He said, "Since you got to Tenebris, have you seen any children?" I said the population had seemed to be on the older side, even though I'd only been there for a day. Before the darkness first arrived, I hadn't seen any kids, nor schools, kindergartens, or even families. Riley sighed. 50 years ago, we had our first bout of darkness. At first, it was nothing more than an oddity we couldn't explain, something we just accepted as a weird phenomenon. Then people started disappearing, always in the dark, never to be found again. He trailed off. A shatter was heard from outside, jolting us all to attention. Through the window, we could see a few glimmers of light vanishing, as one of the searchlights broke down. Time was literally running out. Of course, once we were hit with the horrors that lurked in the dark, people tried to leave. The thing is that something had happened to the population here, those that were born here, those that spent too much time in town. They became bound to the place, finding themselves physically incapable of leaving. Those that ignored their instincts, those who tried to leave anyway, simply vanished without a trace. And what about the kids, I asked. But then he said eventually we decided to just stop bringing more people into this nightmare, as the last child was born 20 years ago, and he was my son. And as he finished the last sentence, a mixed feeling of anger and pity filled me. Then I said, "Why didn't you ask for help?" He said, "Trust me, we tried. But who would believe us? We brought in detectives from different cities, hoping they'd see the darkness. They'd finally help us, but none ever did until you came." Another shatter sounded outside as broken glass fell to the ground and more of the flesh-bound shadows emerged from the dark. "So that's it then? You're just giving up?" I asked. After an uncomfortably long moment of silence, George finally spoke up. "Sheriff, how about the pillar?" he asked. "Don't be ridiculous," Riley shot back. "Wait, what pillar?" I joined in. "It's the source of the darkness." "George, this isn't the time for your stories. Just do not. I understand your trepidation in going there, Sheriff, but we ain't got any other option. You don't even know where it is." "No one does," Riley asked. Then he responded by saying no. "But I don't know where my father, brother, and your son were last seen. I'll lead the search, but I cannot do it alone." By then, everyone had fallen completely silent, and as confused as I was, I felt a hint of hope awakening within me. "What exactly are we gonna do?" I asked. Riley turned to me and sighed. "We're going to destroy the darkness." As children, we were told that darkness wasn't something to fear. Our parents gave us empty promises that there were no monsters hiding in the shadows. They said that whatever creaks and cracks we heard were fragments of our imagination. Yet, we felt the horrors hiding beyond the edge of our vision, the threat looming right in front of us, obscured beyond recognition. We were right to fear the dark. After arriving at Tenebris, my childhood fear of the dark was revived. I quickly realized that it is perhaps the most logical instinct of humanity, once we're even born with, developed to keep us alive since the dawn of humanity thousands of years ago. Detective Riley had just announced the plan to destroy the darkness, a ludicrous suggestion to any sane person, yet it remained our only chance at survival. Then I asked, how the hell are we supposed to do that? We've got explosives available. If the pillar really exists, that's our best bet. And how are we supposed to find it? I just kept asking. Before Riley got the chance to answer any of my questions, another light shattered, causing broken glass to rain down onto the ground. It plunged another section of the building into darkness, allowing the shadow creatures to sneak closer as they came inside. I could see the rotting organs piled up within it, a poor reconstruction of what had once been a human being. It grabbed onto one of the survivors, quickly merging with his flesh. He winced in agony, unable to scream as his lungs turned to mush. "Get him into the light," Riley was yelling. George and I rushed to grab him, pulling him away from the ever-growing darkness. Alice, it was too late, and within just a few seconds, his insides had hollowed, and he'd become one with the shadows. "That is too late. He's gone," George sighed. "Sheriff, we've got to go now." Though there were patrol cars outside, we only had enough portable lights to secure one of the dozen or so survivors. Only 4 would venture out on a suicidal mission. Riley, George, John, and myself. John was one of the few surviving cops, and among the youngest inhabitants of Tenebris. He volunteered without hesitation. "All right, we're dividing the lights in 2. Have to keep the building lit up and the rest for the car," Riley ordered as we guided the survivors into the autopsy room. Without windows and with heavy doors, it remained the safest place for those who stayed behind. The four of us got ready, placing ourselves in front of the exit. Stepping out would most likely lead to certain death, but we had no other option. You'll have a better chance staying behind. This is your last chance to back out, George said. He was an odd fella, with every inhabitant of Tenebris stuck in town, physically incapable of leaving. He'd driven out to pick me up. Why would he break the rule of the dark? That remained a mystery. John looked at me, a look of horror stuck on his face. Though he was eager to help, he lacked the experience the rest of us had. "Let's just go," he said nervously. And with that, Riley unlocked the door. As we walked in formation through the dark, each holding onto a powerful searchlight, it kept the shadows at bay, allowing us to mount each light to the car. Within a couple of minutes, we were driving away from the station on a road of sacrifice. I let out an audible sigh of relief as a false sense of security washed over me. The car had been secured by lights, creating a perimeter of light around us, but it wouldn't last long. "How far is it?" I asked. "An hour's drive on a good day," George said. "But this ain't a good day." George drove the car slowly, with a limited line of sight ahead of us. It was a dangerous streak to travel. At the edges of our perimeter, shadow creatures loomed. They observed us from a distance, somehow absorbing the light, straining our lamps in the process. John focused the beams at the monsters. "Wherever they stand, just keep them away." And that's what Riley said. He stuck his head out the window and pointed the searchlights towards clusters of shadow creatures. They screeched as the light burned them, chasing them away if only temporary. "George, you need to tell us everything you know about the Pillar of Darkness," I ordered. He sighed, mulling over how to answer my loaded question. Back when my old man was the sheriff, when the darkness first introduced itself, he led a search and secure operation into the heart of Tenebris Woods. A kid had gone missing, which wasn't anything we'd experienced before in our small and peaceful town. He trailed off as the road narrowed. We drove over a rock sticking up from the ground, causing one of the lights to shatter. John quickly responded by shifting to rest. "Fuck, if we lose another light, we're screwed," John said in panic. George slowed down even further, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. A day into the search, my father radioed in. He claimed he'd found something in the woods, some sort of dark structure. With his limited vocab, he described it as a pitch-black pillar that swallowed the light in front of him. Despite orders to wait for backup, he approached the damn thing. That was the last thing we heard before they went silent. They were literally the first victims of the darkness. Tenebris would span a massive area. With the limited information we had, it would take us weeks to cover the entire grid. Anyway, they sent out a second search party to look for my dad and the missing officers, or those went missing as well. They sent out a third, and as you might have guessed by now, after the third party went missing, they never sent a fourth. I could tell by Riley's unimpressed demeanor that it was a story he'd heard before. But that's not an exact proof that the pillar exists. I mean, it could have been anything, and that's what Riley said. "Well, that's because you haven't heard the whole story. There's a part I never told anyone." George shut back. I said, "What?" He then said, "It's something that I've seen," and he said that somberly. That single sentence shut us all up, plunging the car into deafening silence. "You've seen it, the pillar?" Riley asked. Then he said it was back when I first joined the police force, before I was reduced to driving people around. I'd grown up without knowing what happened to my old man. After repeated refusals to reopen the investigation, I decided to take things into my own hands. So I set off into the depths of Tenebris Woods, spending the first day just getting to this so-called forbidden zone. No sooner had I crossed the border before the air changed around me. It had been cloudy, sure, but in the span of just a few seconds, the sky went dark. He then took a break as if he felt ashamed. Then he said I was young, afraid, lacking the guts to continue. So I decided to turn back, only no matter what direction I headed in, the sky kept getting darker. And within an hour, I was hopelessly lost and getting desperate. Though I didn't know exactly where I was heading, I could feel the presence of the pillar. It needed sustenance, and I was it, just like any father had been before me. We hit another bump in the road, shattering another light. Then I saw it, a towering structure wrapped in dark tendrils. It stretched far into the sky above, eating any light that dared to touch its rim. I couldn't deny the fact that the pillar was alive, and it needed to be fed. At that time, I still hadn't seen any shadow creatures, or maybe they didn't even exist yet. All I remember is darkness enveloping around me, and before I passed out, George brought the car to a screeching halt. The air felt dense, and the powerful lights we'd mounted to our car just didn't reach as far anymore. "We're here," George said as a surge of dread washed over me. We exited the car, surprised not to be overrun by the shadows. They simply observed us from a distance, keeping away from our lights. Even though we'd lost half of them, our voices didn't carry very far either. Every sound felt muted around us, as if we were speaking underwater. "George, how did you escape that last time?" John asked. He did not respond. He just shook his head. We dismounted the lights and brought them with us. George carried the explosives, being the only one with enough experience to ensure a safe detonation. Hours passed as we ventured deeper into tenebrous woods. It didn't take us long before the last searchlights finally died, leaving us with pathetically weak flashlights. I looked around, flashing my light at the occasional shadow that reached out from the dark, standing by George's side. I felt oddly confident, as if the darkness couldn't touch us. I couldn't say the same for John and Riley, who were repeatedly assaulted by the monsters, leaving George behind. I rushed over to help them when one of the shadows reached out for me, and I fell to the ground. Riley immediately pulled me back up as another shadow reached out for us. The hint of security I'd felt only moments ago vanished. Then I saw George, still walking confidently through the darkness, not a single shadow daring to touch him. "George, the shadows," I said in awe. Then as I got to my feet, I kept asking him, "Are you all right?" "The shadows, they're not," I stuttered in confusion. It was odd, as if a sense of brightness surrounded him. Wherever George stood, darkness retracted, and he didn't even seem to notice. "What?" he asked, still oblivious. "We gotta keep moving," Riley interrupted. "Just stick together, alright?" They couldn't see it. Despite the blaring hole in the darkness, they were unaware. George was the only person to ever face the heart of the darkness and live, and it somehow kept us safe. We kept walking in silence. For each step we took, the force grew thicker. Dead branches hindering our progress. Despite the dense vegetation, there were no signs of life. Even the trees had long since perished, with their dried-out corpses all that were left behind. "We're getting closer," George said. "How do you know?" Riley asked. "I don't know. I just do." There was no point arguing, even with George's weird connection to the pillar. We had no other option but to blindly follow. John walked a bit ahead. He was young compared to Riley and George, and in far shape. "John, slow down, will you?" I asked. "You don't even know the way." And without acknowledging us, he kept walking. Then Riley shouted, saying, "John!" and no response was there. Riley ran ahead to grab him. As he put his hand on John's shoulder, a loud crack could be heard, and his arm just popped out of its joint. John fell to the ground without uttering a single word. His abdomen was sunken in, and his eyes seemed empty. He was dead without anyone noticing. A shadow had gone inside and consumed his guts, all because he stepped a few feet too far ahead. "How the hell did that happen?" Riley asked in shock. "I don't know. He just kept walking." That's what George responded. Then John started speaking. "I have to keep going. I have to keep freaking going. I have to. It needs us. It needs to feed." He kept iterating, quieter each time. His chest sunk in as his lungs were eaten, and he quickly lost the ability to speak. Yet his mouth kept moving. He hopelessly, futilely attempted at talking. "Sheriff, we have to keep moving," I said. "We left John's body behind. No word spoken. We'd accepted our deaths the moment we agreed to the mission. But if we could save the town, it would be worth the risk." The shadows followed us from a distance as we proceeded into the darkness. Our lights were dying and our hopes were thin. Hours just passed, if not days, as we wandered blindly towards the heart of the darkness, awaiting our much-anticipated deaths. Then I noticed the light from my flashlight bending in the wrong direction. It was as if something sucked it away, further plunging us into the shadows. I turned around, noticing thick dark tendrils stretching along the ground, leading to a massive bulging structure. And that was the pillar. It was magnificently horrific, stretching endlessly far up into the sky. Rotting flesh covered its surroundings, and any light getting too close immediately faded into its Vanta black surface. Then it twitched in response to our presence, and the shadows were quick to surround us as we got closer. Then Riley said in shock, "Wow, I cannot believe it." "Yeah, but don't stop to admire it. Keep the perimeter clearer while I fix the explosives." And that's what George said. Riley and I kept the area as safe as we could, while George went to work. With the pillar eating up the light, we could only clear a few feet ahead of us. By then, most of the shadows were flesh-bound within their dark frames. They carried the remnants of the townsfolk. Then Riley started exclaiming, saying, "Oh God." There, on the edge of the darkness, stood the emaciated remnants of John, his body broken, carried by the shadows that occupied his empty husk. John, help me," he groaned back, his voice twisted by the shadow, speaking without air. Alongside the cry for help, he lifted his service weapon and fired. He was too quick for us to react. But even then, he didn't aim for me, nor Riley, but for the one person the shadows could never touch. Then George let out a quick grunt as the bullet tore through his throat. Riley kept his flashlight fixated on the mutilated remnants of John, causing him to drop the gun. I rushed to help George. His carotid artery had been severed, and his trachea torn to shreds. He laid there, bleeding into his own lungs, unable to speak. All he could do was stare at me as he coughed up chunks of half-coagulated blood. Despite the agony, he seemed at peace, as if dying was the preferable choice over a life in tenebris. Then Riley said, "What is going on?" still keeping his light pointed at the shadows. Then without a single word, George died in my arms. He'd spent the past 50 years living in the dark, and now he'd never see the light again. He's literally gone. The light in his eyes had vanished, and with it, the power that kept the shadows at bay. Without hesitation, they approached us, ready to add our flesh to their growing pillar. Riley rushed back towards the explosives, knowing that we couldn't get to a safe distance in time. He grabbed me and pushed me out of the way. "Run! Just run!" I fled away from the pillar, which focused their attention on Riley. We gave each other one final glimpse, and I saw the undeniable feeling of guilt in his eyes. Regret that he'd brought me into tenebris, and regret that he hadn't tried to destroy the darkness before. This was his last chance. The ground shook under my feet. The tendrils had awoken, trying to grab onto me while I stumbled away from the pillar. Behind me, I could hear Riley scream in agony. The shadows had already reached him and were digging their way through his guts. "Come get me, you fuckers," he yelled. Then an impossibly bright light filled the air. Riley had pulled the trigger, and the explosives shattered the pillar behind me. Despite being at a safe distance, the sound and shook wave sent me plummeting to the ground. A walking sound of pain followed the loud explosion. As the darkness retracted back towards the pillar, giving way to light in its way. Once I recovered from the initial shock, I stared up at a clear blue sky. I got to my shaking feet and returned to the site of detonation. Riley and George had been evaporated alongside the remains of the pillar. It was over. The trek back to town was monotonous. Still in shock, I wandered on autopilot, not sure what I would find once I got there. Tenebris was literally a beautiful place, a fact that had been obscured by the dark for so many years. I linked up with the last survivors, all of them speechless. Together, we mourned the loss of those who had perished, gone but never forgotten. they could finally leave Tenebris and find no opportunities. To my surprise, most of them chose to stay behind, for better or for worse. The town had been their home, and they had nothing on the outside. At least it had been given a second chance, and could once again flourish as it had so many years ago. I returned back to my own city a few days later, with no clue how to report what I'd seen. I'm sure they'll come up with something more believable than the tale I have. Not that it matters what the public thinks, but to honor Riley, George, and all those who died, I wanted to share the truth about Tenebris, as they did not die for nothing. And that's the end of the story. If you guys enjoyed this long story, and please share all of your opinions down below in the comment section. And finally, like, share, subscribe, and turn on your notifications bell.